probably heard of cognitive biases, right? Like, for example, confirmation bias, where people notice evidence that confirms their views but don't notice evidence that undermines their views. Confirmation bias is pretty famous these days, and rightly so, because it leads all of us to be more sure we're right than we should be. And this can cause pointless arguments and bitter feuds and devastating wars and apocalypses and so on, all of which get old after a while. But there's a less famous cognitive bias that, if you ask me, does just as much damage as confirmation bias and deserves a lot more attention than it gets. It's called attribution error. Once you become aware of attribution error, your view of the world, especially your view of other people, will never be the same. At least, I hope it will never be the same. If it's the same, then I have failed in my mission. The word attribution in attribution error refers to the way we explain people's behavior. Like, if you're in a checkout line and the guy in front of you is rude to the clerk, and you think, that guy's a jerk, then you are attributing his behavior to his disposition, to his character, to the kind of person he is. If, on the other hand, you say, that guy's probably an okay guy who is rarely rude, but maybe just had a really tough day that shifted him into be rude to clerks mode, then you're attributing his behavior to situation, to circumstance, not to his basic disposition. Decades ago, psychologists found that people, when explaining the behavior of other people, tend to put too much emphasis on disposition and not enough on situation. They overestimate the role of a person's basic nature and underestimate the role of circumstance. In other words, people tend to go with, what a jerk, not, maybe he just had a bad day. Psychologists called this tendency the fundamental attribution error, and it's pretty interesting, but not nearly as interesting as the fact that things turned out to be a little more complicated than these psychologists thought. We now know that there are two cases in which people tend to downplay the role of disposition and play up the role of situation. First, if an enemy or rival of ours does something good, we're inclined to attribute that to circumstance. He's not giving money to the beggar because he's a good person. He's just trying to impress some bystander, like my girlfriend, for example, in the case of a romantic rival. If those bystanders weren't there, he would be his usual heartless self. The second case where we downplay disposition is if a close friend or ally does something bad. She's yelling at a beggar who asks for money not because she's a bad person, but because she's stressed out over something. Or maybe she didn't get enough sleep. Could be that. Or too much caffeine. The flip side of all this, of course, is that when our friends and allies do good things, that's a reflection of their disposition, their character. And when our enemies and rivals do bad things, that's a reflection of their character. So when you put all this together, it's a very effective recipe for keeping yourself convinced that your enemies and rivals are terrible people, whereas your friends and allies are good people. Congratulations on choosing your friends and enemies so wisely. A social scientist named Herbert Kellman once pointed out that attribution error can help push nations toward war. He wrote, attribution mechanisms promote confirmation of the original enemy image. Hostile actions by the enemy are attributed dispositionally and thus provide further evidence of the enemy's inherently aggressive, implacable character. Conciliatory actions are explained away as reactions to situational forces, as tactical maneuvers, responses to external pressure, or temporary adjustments to a position of weakness, and therefore require no revision of the original enemy image. You know what I think that explains? I think it explains why people who want their country to invade some other country work so hard to frame that other country's leader as evil incarnate. Because once we've got him in the enemy's box, there's no way out. Same goes for our personal enemies or rivals. I mean, escape from the enemy's box isn't impossible. Like, for example, if an enemy of mine abjectly apologizes for having wronged me and begs earnestly for forgiveness and starts rending his garments, I will consider a box reassignment. But I don't recall that ever happening. Here's an exercise I recommend. Sit down, close your eyes, and think about a rival or enemy. Pay attention to the feelings that arise. Those are the feelings that trigger attribution error. If you sit with those feelings long enough and continue to pay attention to them, their power may wane. And the more it wanes, the more objective a view you will have of your rival or enemy. The more clearly you will understand why they actually do the things they do. And that can help you deal with rivals and enemies more skillfully, in ways that wind up doing less damage to you than obeying your cognitive biases would do. You may also wind up doing less damage to them, to your rivals and enemies, than obeying your cognitive biases would do. And if that bothers you, maybe you should sit down and close your eyes and reflect on your feelings about your rivals and enemies some more.